Good evening, folks. Tonight we're going to be performing a little play for you by Ibsen, but that's not why we're here. Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people here supporting the Trias reading series curated by our Trias writer-in-residence, Lydia Yuknovich. And tonight we have the honor of welcoming Janice Lee, who spent some time with our Trias workshop group today, and is going to be reading from you, at least in part, from her soon-to-be-published novel. So that's pretty exciting. It's going to be brand new stuff that hasn't been published yet. I'm just going to say a couple thank yous, and then I'm going to allow Lydia to do the formal introduction. First, our great thanks is owed to Peter Trias, an alum of Hobart College who graduated from here, went to the famed Iowa Writers Workshop, and then followed the inevitable trajectory towards being a real estate mogul in Los Angeles. And that's how poetry happens, you guys. It turns into real estate like magic. And he always cherished poetry, and he himself published a collection of poetry, and he wanted students after him to have the kind of rich experience that he had here. And so he enabled this year-long residency, and we bring in fantastic people like Lydia, and in fact, this spring, all of you will have the chance, should you wish it, to join next year's Trias Writers Workshop. You don't have to be an English major, and you don't have to be an upperclassman, so keep an eye out for that in spring registration, not fall. Not happening now, happening in the spring. This program also relies on the support of members of the English department, the Provost's office, and the inestimable Sue Gage. The bookstore also, if you will cast your eyes back towards the back of the room, comes here and makes sure that you can buy the books by the authors that you've just heard. And the wonderful thing about doing that is that then you can get the autograph of that author. You can get an inscription, and Janice has agreed that she will be willing to do that for you if you want to get a signature. If you have the book already, she will also sign, and then you can sell it on eBay for like $10 million. Is that what your sign books are going for? $10 million for one volume, but don't sell it because it's only going to go up. Okay. Once again, thank you guys so much for coming. Our next reader this fall is going to be Thérèse Maillot, and she'll be here on December 4th, but because it's December and this is Geneva, there's also a snow date, December 5th. So keep an eye out for December 4th if it's not snowing, / December 5th. Okay, thank you guys very much.
Hello, squad. I'm really excited to be here because I love Janice's writing so much, but I'm also excited because I kind of made a triptych out of the introduction, since you had to make triptychs. So it kind of moves in 3 movements, okay? And the first movement is kind of traditional bio. And the second movement moves toward an idea that Janice writes about and has talked about. And the third movement is just a straight up love letter. Because I can. So I hope it doesn't embarrass you. So here's the straight up bio stuff, but I'm going to read part of it really slowly so it can really go into your body. Janice Lee is a Korean-American writer, editor, publisher, and shamanic healer. She's the author of 4 books of fiction: KEROTAKIS, Daughter, Damnation, Imagine a Death, and 2 books of creative nonfiction: Reconsolidation and The Sky Isn't Blue, which Squad read. This is the, I'm slowing it down part. Maybe not that slow. She writes about interspecies communication. So you need to think about it for a second. Let me know if I need to repeat it. Plants and personhood. The filmic long take. Slowness. Apocalypse. Memory. Architectural and internal spaces. Plant and animal medicine. Inherited trauma. The concept of Han in Korean culture. And she asked the question, how do we hold space open while maintaining intimacy? I want to tell you that she has a novel coming out in 2021 called Imagine a Death, so that you can pace yourself and get ready to buy it the second it comes out. That novel, Imagine a Death, is, I'm going to tell you a little bit what it's about because it comes up in all of her writing too. And this is like a summary. In the face of a slow but impending apocalypse, what binds three seemingly divergent lives, a writer, a photographer, and an old man, isn't the commonality of a perceived future death, but the layered and complex fabric of how loss, abuse, trauma, and death have shaped their past, and how these pasts continue to haunt their present moments. But something else happens in Imagine a Death that happens in other writing of Janice's, which is horrible, difficult, terrible things are right next to unbelievably beautiful things. This brings me to the second panel of the triptych. Janice writes and talks a lot about an idea from Korean culture called Han. Raise your hand if you've heard of that before. See, this is your night. We're going to educate you. And there is a kind of shorthand way to talk about the concept of Han, which is kind of like beautiful sorrow or the beauty of sorrow. But when Janice is interviewed about it, she's much more eloquent. And so this is a little bit from an interview that she gave. And it's kind of on the topic of generational trauma. This is Janice speaking. I don't know how to write about a trauma that is not mine, yet invisibly and with utmost uncertainty, I have inherited its wounds. I don't know how to write about a wound that I cannot see, a wound that I don't remember receiving, a wound that is often forgotten, but somehow felt. For many Korean American writers, we don't have direct access to the major events that shaped the Han of our parents and grandparents, like the Japanese occupation, the Korean War, the Gwangju massacre. And then she talks about how Han isn't only about the trauma from large-scale, big historical events, but also small things individuals carry that come through generations, and sometimes those things are registered in silence or avoidance. And she raises the question, how can something be incredibly devastating and incredibly beautiful at the same time? And she says, this is the paradox of our current circumstances. And when I read that, I thought, yep. And it's a nexus in her writing quite often for me. We have come to the third panel of my introduction, which is the love letter. So this is a love letter from a woman writer to a woman writer, and I don't even care what you think. Some writers lift themselves up and away from the ground into the sheen and glitz and bleached teeth of popularity and celebrity, and their books are shiny objects, products ready for instant consumption. Other writers bring us back to life from the ground up, from the deep root of things, from the dirt of it, from the body, from the air and water and sky of things, from the whales and dogs and dragonfly of things, from the tree and the skin story of it all. Janice Lee's work makes my intellect hum, but it also makes my body vibrate, because she lets her language loose across a field of experience where language and the body can encounter each other again. Her language reminds me how to be alive inside being and becoming like the planet, for better or worse, rather than selved and shelved by ego and capitalism. That's a concept you can read about in a Rumpus essay Janice wrote in January. So go to the Rumpus in January, look for this essay on that topic. If I am inside one of her images, I want to stay there and let it look back at me, let it hold me. If I am inside one of her elongated sentences, I want to know where my body edges and the sentence edges meet each other. I am personally of the opinion that language and books and art should happen to you. They should rearrange something about you. Suspend the action of us long enough to remember a heartbeat, or breathing, or sweating. Words let loose long enough to become matter with us and in us. I am in love with language as being, and thus I am in love with the work of Janice Lee, and I am also in love with Janice Lee, and I'm not sorry. Can you please help me give it up for Janice Lee?
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Lydia, for that. I feel like you just rearranged all of my molecules right now, so I'm just like adjusting. Whew. So I'm going to read just a little bit from The Sky Isn't Blue, because I know some of you read that. And then I'm going to read some poems that are brand new, and then I will finish with a chapter from this new novel, which is very different than what I've written previously. And I can say a little bit more about that when I get there. And for the class that I was visiting today, I was talking about my first book, right, that has no page numbers and where I was very rebellious, and that book happens to be back there, which is very shocking to me. But it is there, so you can see my non-page numbered book. So I'm going to read a little bit from The Sky Isn't Blue, and it's from the section called Ocean Beach Pier. And there are these poetic fragments that are kind of woven in throughout, and I'm just going to read those sections. There it was under the blue sky, the birth and death of Mother. It was Mother's ghost bearing the rain who came to speak of sorrow. When one does not know to abandon her children, she does not know the embrace of death. Haunting isn't for the dead, but for the living. Be prepared for the sea to be your confession. Still, almost fearlessly, she stood there, Mother. When Mother spoke out loud, the first word was blue. Blue was the color of a confession given under the sign of the fish. Swimming wildly under golden glints of sunlight, the fish only knew to embrace the sorrow. Sorrow is Mother, is the utterance of an embrace that is the color blue. Can't you feel it with your eyes, the intensity of its sorrow? Only when you encounter death and its embrace can you feel the sun setting behind your eyes. I wonder why we are allowed to live. Don't you realize that it's all always leading up to this one moment of death? Here the caw or beckon of a bird, here a creature's wound. The wound is the only language that is understood by Mother. Glory is the sun, is the fish's stomach embracing the eyes of death, or the sorrow is only known when death is a ghost behind your shoulder, that blue embrace. Feel with your eyes, and death might already exist at the bottom of your stomach. I told you already that it would be easy to change, if not for the wound of blue. Embracing the blue dust of Mother brings the rain, the night, the feelings. Embracing Mother brings the sorrow, the sky, the wound of confession. I confess that I miss my mother. Go, little bird, to the blue wound in the sky. Go, taste the depths of night and the color of salt, ghostly. Ghosts that flutter like salt in the blue waves that beckon. Ghosts that flutter between the blades of grass and call out, mother, in the night. It is night now and I cannot sleep. It is night now and I can sense the nostalgia of rain, but the rain is not here. No, not yet, the rain. Mother, where are you? Here it was, the extracted embrace of a cow's stomach lying out there in the night. Here it was, the salt of sorrow and the blue wound we call home, the home that will soon be obliterated by the color of feeling, the ghost of blue. The home that will be covered over with your confession, a dying fish out in the sun, neglected, haunted. The cow is the fish set out to dry. The cow is the stomach that churns during the sky's clear and resonant confession. The heat is what you feel when you wake up in the morning, the heat of a million dying fish. It is night, it is blue, where is mother now? Bring the light, says the dying fish. It is already here, says the dead cow. You are ghosts already, sings the sky, blue and salty and hidden under your wound. The ghost is what you feel when you wake up in the morning. A few short poems from this new project that I just finished, and it's called Separation Anxiety. And all of the poems are untitled. They're just part of separation anxiety, and it's about my separation, impending separation anxiety from my dog, who's very old, he's 15. But also a lot of things that I'm just realizing and learning as I'm learning to become a shamanic healer, and I'm learning all of these things about myself and different types of wisdom. So all of that is sort of woven into these poems. Have you noticed all of the shocked faces of others when you aren't able to learn the lesson that you are teaching others? When there's snow, you can cover, smooth the way, as in, it's colder now, as in, what you eat is tied to the cow that graces, slowly contemplating the uncertainty of what comes next. Only the cows have the time to think so extensively about time. You might look less at your palm if you could recall the density of the forest. When I reach the entrance of my middle world, there is a fire burning. I sit beside it and wait for my healed state to appear. Many approach, and with each arrival I think, yes, you are the one. Bear, crow, elephant, snail, badger, whale, even Worf appears, and I wave him away saying, you don't belong here. As I stare into the fire, I try to breathe and practice patience and presence, and then the glint of a hawk's eye and the hawk's gaze and my mother's ghost inside the hawk inside myself. I report back, the hawk, but what my teacher asks me is, who is the fire? Nothing is dying. Yes, 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 nods the dog. This is directly related to your understanding of the world. Listen, when you lash out, I can't help but scream, arise woven like loud pistols, and I said once that I just need you to listen, but your listening voice keeps conjuring all of my ghosts. I buried that shit in the garden, used it for compost. It's just the fear that keeps calling them back. Telepathy resists barriers, but when I let the weeds grow, I forget to let my guard back down. It is becoming more and more precarious to be an individual, to carry the fear of losing one's dog without succumbing completely to devastation. What I'm working towards is this image of human body with arms open and outstretched, receiving light, rather than this image of human body, hunched over, clenched and tight, fist closed, white knuckles. Of letting the world work, of accepting the cycles of the universe. Benny, I don't know how to let you go, of knowing we have already lived many lives together. Mama, go now, and the universe will know to see us together again, attempting the life-sustaining posture, to not crumble and break completely. Mama, it's okay. To accept that it's not all over just because you are leaving. I must continue loving when you are gone. An invitation to empathetic seeing might begin with the tree, might begin with the phrase, I suppose. And the density of a forest might begin at the edges, blurred, unfocused. One tree falls down and we all hear it falling. The other trees around it rattle and shake, are affected by the other tree, are affected. When there is so much green, we might penetrate the picture space. We find ourselves lost in the shades of green. When the person in front of us is dressed in blue, we might speak for them in a bout of empathy and find ourselves lost in the shades of blue. This is the density of color when one has nowhere left to go. When their back is to us, we might think, just get a grip, man, and then they do get a grip. Still lost in the green, one might think it all ends where it begins, and yet nothing begins again, and the landscape is green and rain, and the body is obscured by the veil of moisture, and the green is obscured by eyes looking, and the edges blur again as a cow moves slowly. The periphery is unreliable. The cow is unreliable. The spectator is unreliable. The rain is unreliable. Empathy is unreliable. I remember the feeling of being alive. I feel something, yet find myself located here. It isn't so green here. Neither am I welcomed by the intimacy of the rain. Neither has it ended yet. Neither has it begun. Okay, so I'm going to read a chapter from this novel, Imagine a Death, that Lydia mentioned is coming out. There are three characters. There's a writer, and there's a photographer, and there's an old man, and they don't have names. They're kind of archetypes, but also very, very specific. And so this one chapter that I'm going to read is about the writer. I don't know if I want to say anything else. Maybe that's it. Yeah, okay. In another place, not close nor far, yet connected very closely nonetheless. After all, there is nothing that connects us all together except for the element of time, or if time is a construct like so many of us believe, simply the states of being and irritation and seasons that cycle through endlessly, and the swoopings of pigeons bracketed by flashing lights. She kneels before a large oak tree covered in browning moss and lichen, and she waits, idly, for death perhaps, the reaching branches like thick threads that frame and reframe the deliberation of breath, the supposed sincerity of the intention of living. And crawling up her legs, she sees two black specks. She has read that ants are drawn to suicide. And though she attempts to transform the intention of this ritual into one of apology, into a kind of impetus to regain her forward momentum and to translate all of this into a new language, her hands, like the thick and gnarled branches of the tree, only seem to reach towards the hospital ward from some distant memory. Her mother lying on a cold bed in the other room, the nurses insisting that she is too young to see her mother's body, even though she's the one who discovered the body on the street. And the nurses insist that it is better for her to hold on to the memory of her mother before. Beautiful, black hair flowing whole and erect and standing there, the smile on her face as she turned to look back once more before running into the school building that morning. That it would be better to hold on to that memory rather than the image of her mother's corpse, now on that bitterly cold bed in the other room, discolored, disfigured, dismembered. And she is reminded of the hole in her mother's head, is reminded that the sky holds things that murder, and with the forecast of fair skies, she revels in the quality of silence and the attentiveness of the heat, and imagines, like an ancient samurai, that she might give in to deliberate sincerity, not of living, but of disemboweling oneself. She had dreamt already many nights of the generosity of suicide, of granting a request of this magnitude. And, equipped with intention, she captures the profound resolve behind tearing one's own belly open, the accompanying silence of the simulation. Equipped with the resolve, but not the blade that can break skin, unlike chopping up a dead fish, unlike cutting tofu, unlike dying, and then, crosswise, the tradition of ripping your bowels open like this, the necessity of being satisfied that one has fully torn open their bowels like this, the eternity before the final strike, before the severing that comes as a relief. In this case, it is a relief to lose one's head. And here, because your sword is also your soul, dragging open your wooden and dull soul through your bowels, the eternity of this moment, the persistence of wood against skin, of wood against flesh, and the stubborn nature of organs unwilling to tear themselves open, the wading through poverty that becomes an unbearable intensity compared to the wading of death, the dragging of a bamboo sword inside of your body. Even in this imagining, she has been unable to provide herself with a truly sharp object, and instead of preventing the pain she has seen as possible, has created a grosser and more unbearable kind of pain in her cowardice, in her fear of swiftness and mercy, to fully realize the dream of an honorable death. And she imagines that there are listeners in the shadows, the ghost of her own mother perhaps watching and listening to this great harmonic richness of pain and difficulty and expression. And as they watch, she swallows, the lump that proceeds ever so slowly down her throat, watching, her lower lip quivers, watching, no, not yet, waiting. In this slow and protracted moment, one has all the time in the world. In this delivery of a sword, this contrary rhythm dictating a spurred ritual, the slow agony of this eternal harakiri swallows whole a glimpse, the slow waiting of life, that is, the eternity of this moment. This organic configuration of shameless imitation, brushing violently up against one's bowels, this slow, delayed symphony of death suspended, ancient and eternal and infinite, and it eclipses the waiting that is the rest of one's entire life, ended only by the most generous of gestures, death. Of course, this is only imagined, and the manipulation of her own interdependent relationship with death is just a single fiber of the system that she has woven to fulfill her basic human needs. In a dream she often has, there is a little girl wandering the street, looking for her mother among the other piled bodies. How many dead mothers, she thinks, how many? The different modes and textures of language become more apparent in darkness, become more apparent as the moths that only show themselves when it is dark, yet are drawn to the light, stupid creatures that don't seem to be able to be stopped, and yet it ought to matter that they are moths, that they are winged creatures, that they possess something that humans don't, including the incapacity for speech. She still does not know why she continues to write. Once, at a book signing, a man in the audience raised his hand to ask a question. What do you enjoy about writing? It had been such an innocuous question, of course, but also as she stood up there awkwardly, she was always self-conscious as to her posture and so had to direct a large amount of energy into not constantly pulling up her pants and correcting her posture and cracking her neck and fidgeting with her hands, knowing that people were watching and that these visible actions would appear stranger than her appearing slightly uncomfortable without a podium to hide behind. But as writers so often are categorized as being socially awkward anyways, why not use the image as a form of conviction? And instead of aiming to be extraordinary, just aiming to fit the frame that had conveniently been created for her. Frames also being beautiful and rhetorical and consoling on occasions when it is more accepted to give in to one's discomfort rather than to try to correct it in an abandonment of virtue toward, instead, characteristics like charisma and likability. She realized the impossibility of this question, that what he was really asking or assuming was that she did enjoy writing, and that she was partaking in this quaint hobby because she already enjoyed a life of being able to let the air out of her lungs whenever she desired, and that she wasn't constantly on the verge of breaking down and giving in to the creaking of the floorboards and wedging her own body down there beneath them to dull the creaking in the middle of the night, and that she didn't believe in God, but instead in the power of the word in the way that allowed agnostics to hold the kind of faith that Abraham held, and that she might have some kind of insight on how to more fully enjoy one's life and to embody the beauty of the sky as she sat down each evening to write. In all of those assumptions, she felt herself getting tired. She didn't want to answer the question, but she was more afraid of the potential contempt that would come from giving an incorrect one. And so her eyes shifted around the room, resting briefly on a little girl in the bookstore, seated on a tiny chair made for tiny people in the children's corner, happily and visibly enjoying the activity of flipping rapidly through a large book, almost as big as her entire body. And she thought back to her own childhood, and knowing that readers love sentimentality and nostalgia, answered, "It reminds me of reading with my mother, the stories she used to read to me and create for me. And so the narratives I create now are like a way of being closer to her, creating a ghost to properly haunt me." The man smiled and nodded, and she released the air that had been building up in her lungs this entire time, felt the whoosh of capability and the expectancy that had been buried in the heart of things, the details of her own journey to this point hazy and as genuinely unreadable as the manuscript she was attempting to finish now. She hears the sound of her dog's feet walking across the floor, and her knees start to shake, wobbly, as if she had been supporting the weight of someone larger than her resting on her shoulders, her head remaining rigid, and she a participant in some non-consensual initiation. She knows all too well the feeling of constant fear, the suffocation that comes with the arrow slits of sunlight that make visible the dust particles in the empty space of the room, and the enormous last deep breath she has to take before the next last deep breath, and then another. She thrashes out her arms because sometimes she finds it easier to think with her body rather than with words, and so dips her pen into the murdering sky and thinks about her mother, thinks about her parents she was given to after the hospital, thinks about the room in the old church where she was kept, sometimes in the dark, a single black rosary as her only companion. "When did you become so damn Catholic?" she remembers a colleague joking with her when she asked him what she thought of her newest manuscript. The book had been about a daughter that couldn't find herself on equal footing with the rest of the equation that included mother, father, son, so much mythology and religious significance tied to those titles. And yet, the daughter, only a fictional character, attempted to investigate the root of the word inhabitation, and only discovered that it was a word saved for depravity or monsters. And as in the face of the colleague who had proceeded to laugh at her, she exhibits herself waiting and blinks as if in the face of an oncoming car in the middle of the night. One decisive factor for the increased anxiety today is that she has agreed to attend a dinner tonight. Her editor had advised her that it would be good for her image, to emerge from her cage a little more often, and that it would help her work be in better dialogue with the conditions of the world. She knows that she agreed to attend a dinner because she won't be meeting her deadline, and she wishes to maintain the image of complacency. One of her worst fears is that she might be labeled as difficult, and like the memories she also works hard to keep buried, her inability to connect intimately with anyone is also something she tries not to make visible. She can't tell if it is hot today because she doesn't know how to interpret the sweat beads on her arms. And sometimes the boiling heat has a way of claiming her in a way she can't do with herself. Like so many others, she doesn't know how to escape her own skin. That feeling of a necessary and precise disjunction from the body in which one is contained, inspected, exigent. She doesn't know how to leave for just a few moments in order to allow her body to remain in its anxiety as just flesh, without the wounds of a heart that are incapable of resolving themselves. That sense of utter despair that comes from a life of, yes please, no, I don't know, perhaps. In an effort to open up some kind of true osmosis with the world at large, she wants to feel the wind inside herself, not just her skin. She wants to absorb her own tears back through her eyeballs and take one good deep breath as her, not her. She carves tiny pieces of flesh out from beneath her fingernails. That part of the tip of the finger where the skin is tender and hidden and accessible. And though she screams each time she pushes the blade downward, and though it is inexact and sloppy, the blade hardly small enough for precision cutting beneath a growing fingernail. For one generous hour, she is the one inflicting the pain on herself, just her fingers. And she can, in fact, feel safe from the crowded caboose cars and buses, from the exigencies of walking down the street under a clear blue sky, from the sleepless nights stumbling in and out of dreams that are as much about escaping yesterday as they are about escaping tomorrow. She lies down in the bathtub. The hot water hugs her skin fully and completely. All of her crevices feel warm and penetrated, and she can feel the water entering her body through the punctures beneath her fingernails. At the same time, she can feel the blood leaving outwards from her fingertips. And in this way, she can seep in and out with the world for a brief moment and relieve herself of the intensity that builds up inside a body that refuses to yield itself to the constant negotiation of the eternal street. And she can color the water red and redder and muddy, and the success of death can meet the failure of life in this elegant dance of red around a body submerged in water. The body controlled by an overwhelming feeling of being suspended. And the water that is hot and which slowly and ever so gradually cools with the passage of moments or with the intensifying of red and awareness of self. The bathroom light flickers. She does not notice and is already somewhere else. The desert, perhaps. Is already in transit. Is already and simply not here. And really, that is all she has ever hoped for. Thank you.
I'm working on pressing the button. Thank you. Just pressing some buttons. While I'm doing this, oh, green light came on. It's on. Does anyone have any questions?
There was a point in that chapter that you just read where you switched to I. For like a split second, it was talking instead of me. Reminds me of my mother, but the entire rest of it was she. So I'm wondering who that I was calling.
It was, so it was the she. It was an internal thought. Yeah, which is hard, it's hard to read out loud because they're in italics. And that was like, they're like only a few sentences. Yeah.
Who else?
Sorry, I was going to try not to ask anything, but can you talk a little bit about, do you think there's such a thing as the long take in narrative prose? And is it related at all to your interest in the long take in film? And on the page, what do you think it does to time? And is it like what it does in film, or is it unlike what it does? Is that okay?
Yeah, so it's something I think about really often. So my favorite director, Bellatar, who is famous for these long takes, collaborates Most of his films are collaborations with the novelist Laszlo Krasznahorkai, who's known for long sentences. But the two don't correlate, right? The long take in the film is not the equivalent of the long sentence in Krasznahorkai's novels, and that's because in the films, nothing is happening in these long takes. Like, there's no interiority, there's very little dialogue, people are moving. But in the novels, Krasznahorkai goes in and out of interiors, and it's all over the place, and you end a sentence and you like forgot what even happened in the sentence, like you're just totally meandering around. So it's a very, very different effect. And so I've thought often about it, and I think that long sentences definitely do something for contracting or protracting time, but it's not consistently in the present the same way as it is in film. There's something about withholding a cut which actually withholds time. But in language, you can have parentheticals and you can have asides and you can go to all of these different places, but because you have to read language linearly, there's something about the conflict between wanting to be non-linear in a linear form that I think makes your body feel really weird. So it's always weird for me writing them and then reading them, and then reading them out loud is a whole different thing. Like, I have to like practice breathing. And so it's interesting to me for that because it's actually fucking with time in a way that isn't easily articulatable. Yeah.
I'd have to, can I keep talking for 1 second? I'd have to like track it with it in front of me, but there were, and I don't know if anyone else felt this, but there are places in the story where I feel more in my body. And there are other places where I feel less in my body and it recedes, and I'd love to track that and see what kind of language is doing that to me.
Yeah, I mean, I would be fascinated to know, because when I'm writing these sentences, I'm like here, and then I'm like here, and then I'm like here, but it's like a continuous movement, and I'm going in and out of my body, I'm going deeper and deeper into certain things. It's like I'm in a trance. It's really, really difficult and exhausting. So yeah.
I'll get back to you.
Okay.
I would like to look at that.
All right, what else?
Hi, I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your training to be a shaman.
Yes. Yes, I'm trained to be a shaman. I am learning the tradition of the people who live in the Andes Mountains, the Kero people. It's a tradition that I'm learning like from my teacher, and alongside that I'm also learning practices of my ancestors, Korean shamanism, among other things. And what it's done is that it's changed my relationship to language, because so much about shamanism is about direct experience. It's not about language, right? And so almost everything that I do and that I learn, it's totally related to what I'm interested in and my relationship with the world. But it's not in language. And so it's taking me, it's changing how I have to think about the ways in which language actually might fix things and concretize things. That is sometimes useful. But when I'm talking about trauma, or when I'm trying to do healing on my own, what that concretizing can actually, how that concretizing can actually do harm. So it's something that I'm struggling with. Yeah.
Other questions?
I was wondering, when you're writing poetry as opposed to writing like prose, is there certain like impulses you have while writing poetry that you think are unique to poetry as opposed to prose? And also, are there like shared impulses that you experience between both?
Yeah. So I think about genres as being more like on a continuum or on a spectrum, right? I don't see them as being in these boxes. And so there are conventions that belong to each that I think we as generally society, like, okay, when we see characters, when we see narrative, it resembles fiction. And when we see line breaks or stanzas, it resembles poetry. So that already creates certain modes, right? And so those are modes that I look at. Sometimes I'm thinking in sentences, sometimes I'm thinking in fragments. But I also think about what the form is on the page. And so a lot of my writing is already kind of in between. Some of my writing is kind of in between poetry and fiction, and my friends will have fights about what it is. And so I think there are some ways in which I try to resist genre and I just want to call it writing. And in other ways, I recognize that actually sometimes it's really important for me to call something fiction because I need it to live in the category of fiction so that when people see it and it doesn't look like fiction, they understand that I'm actually purposely trying to disrupt the canon and history that has come before it, right? So sometimes the categories matter in that way. Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
This is not fully formulated, but we were talking at dinner about the concept of applying a poetic form like a sestina or a formal form, structured form to a landscape. And I'm wondering if you ever think of doing the opposite or think of your work as doing the opposite in the sense of taking like a map or using writing as a map or using a non-literary form that's not supposed to have to do with language necessarily as a model for writing, or if that, in reading your essays, sometimes I think of them as maps of spaces or maps of thought.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if that's ever something that you consider.
That's a really good question. I think they can definitely be maps. Maps are just representations spatially, which text and language can also do. I think the interesting thing about language is that it's a weird intermediary, right? So I love language, but it also does a lot of mediating, right? And so if there's a map, it's explaining it to you in language in which you have to now imagine in your head. And in some ways, that's a layer or an obstacle, and in some ways, and this gets to like how I think about intimacy in text, is that because the other person has to imagine it in their head, on a personal, it's like a personalized screen, right? We're not looking at the same painting. It's much more intimate, actually. So there's something about language to me that creates both that distance and intimacy. So like maps, yes, but also like I'm constantly listening to music or watching things as I write, and that's not necessarily apparent. Like you wouldn't know what I'm listening to, but they're like some specific soundtracks that are curated. So a lot of that goes into it, and so the way that it comes out, I think I don't necessarily have control over, but I think it can take a lot of different non-linguistic forms. Yeah.
Anyone else? Lily.
So this isn't a question, but in class today you were telling us about the sunset exercise you did. I thought it was really cool, and I think everyone else will think it was cool too.
About the what
The
exercise?
sunset?
Oh,
Yeah.
you should do it. Yeah. The exercise that she's talking about is another writer friend and I. We just watched the sunset every day for like a few months, and it was just a challenge to try and come up with new language every day to describe the sunset. And the sunset is constantly changing. It is different every day. It's a once-in-a-lifetime encounter every day, and yet it's so out of reach in terms of how to articulate it in language because, it's not like one color, there's multiple colors and things are changing. And when we did this, I realized that actually I stopped focusing just on the visual. I was also focusing on like sounds, like if dogs were barking or if there were crows or if there were things happening on the street. So like suddenly the sunset expanded out into the other space. And then I started writing about like what was happening inside of me, and then I was like, wait, it's supposed to be about the sunset. So yeah, I think just it's a cool exercise, and it doesn't have to be the sunset, but I think just like paying really close attention to one thing over a prolonged period of time actually teaches you how to pay attention in general.